people listen and pay attention to what you say and what you do. And because of that too, you will approach the problems of life, social problems, whatever they may be, from a slightly different, or perhaps a very, very large difference in your approach compared to others. You're approaching it from a different angle, aren't you? From the angle or the dimension of the Causton. Therefore, inevitably what you're saying is fresh. Something maybe which others haven't heard before, though to you it may be commonplace because it's the Buddhist view, but to them it won't be. So one person listens and maybe is impressed by that one small point. Maybe it's in a discussion in an office, or, you know, a few mums getting together while they're waiting to see the doctor in a clinic before they have a baby, or it may be a nurse, you know, talking to other nurses in a hospital, wherever, whatever. But someone may be impressed with that one point, that one view which is fresh and new. Therefore they tell someone else. At some point, similar subject comes up. They remember that view or aspect. They tell it to someone else. That person tells it to someone else. Maybe each one tells that viewpoint to many people. And so, you know, the effect of that one person practicing to the Causton spreads outwards and outwards and outwards. This is the way of Causton Rufu. And of course, after a time, once one is established more strongly on that path of life, it's not only what you say, but it's also what you do that affects others. People watch your life. Maybe they see somehow that you're always protected in some strange way, or that things seem to work for you, though you still have sufferings and difficulties, but you get through them and advance your life. Or, as your responsibilities grow, so you're actually able to put into action even small reforms which can make life better for the human beings who work in that particular field. This is the way of Causton Rufu. Each one on his own path, each one standing alone and affecting or influencing his environment. So I wanted to make that clear by relating that concept of Causton Rufu, which you can all understand when it's practically spoken about in terms of politics and education. So we're not all politicians, or intended or destined to be. We're certainly not statesmen. But politics affects everybody. Education affects everybody. We cannot sit back and say, I don't know anything about politics and I don't want to know about them. Or we shouldn't, because it affects everyone's lives intimately, doesn't it? The decisions that are taken by politicians. And so, therefore, what we discussed in the session on politics was that we have the good fortune to have a democratic system. We're not in a dictatorship, whatever one may say about Mrs. Thatcher. We're not in a fascist country. We're not in a communist country. We have a democratic system, but we've got to make the democratic system much better. And we can do it, each in our individual way, just by determining to take responsibility to make that democratic system work. Some people may do it in quite a big way, in their local neighborhood or in their local government, in the borough council. Other people are doing it in small ways, even just encouraging people to vote for what they believe to be right is a great service in itself to the people of this country as a whole. We have a democratic system, therefore, as Buddhists who can chant Daimoku and activate the Buddha wisdom and compassion in our lives, we can influence things as long as we take the first steps in our own lives to do so. And that first step may merely be keeping pace with politics. Maybe we've been a person who can't be bothered with them. We can't afford not to be bothered with them. We should know something about them and become aware of it. The same with education, isn't it? Education is everyone's business. We may not be all teachers. Some of us may. But we're not all teachers. Yet, in fact, we all can be teachers. It's in our interests, isn't it, to be educated ourselves. There are things in life maybe we feel we've missed out in. And often when people start to chant, they decide to go to college or whatever and take out that particular subject. But in any case, we're educators if we have children. That's where education begins. So we are educators. Education is important to us, not just for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren. Therefore, to be concerned about education, to do any little thing that might help to make it better through the power of the Gonzon working in us is important. As a parent, eventually, we may, decide to go regularly to parents' meetings at the school, instead maybe of not bothering. Not only to hear about how one's child is getting on, but also to understand how the school works and to see where perhaps things we feel are not quite right, whether they really are not quite right, and what is the cause of it. And taking action, if we feel it's necessary, to try to put them right, and so on and so on. So really, it is taking responsibility, isn't it, as a citizen, for our life and trying to help make this country a better place to live in small ways and, of course, in big ways too. So I felt it was important to relate, in other words, our movement for the human revolution and for Causton Rufu first to those realities, those social matters involved in politics and in education. Then we go back today to begin to talk about where all this inspiration comes from and how where it comes from can go wrong in some people in terms of the inner self. And next session in terms of the outer self, which is our environment. So, of course, it's interesting the way Sensei approached this whole dialogue. He began by talking about the inner self and the environment. It enabled him to introduce to Professor Toynbee two extremely important principles of Buddhism, or really three. First was the prime point of protecting the dignity of life. And the second were the principle of Shikishin Funi. Shikishin Funi, the inseparability of one's body and spirit. That they're totally interwoven and interact with each other in every human life. And thirdly, Esho Funi, the inseparability of ourselves and our environment. So he tackled those straight away at the beginning because they're so fundamental to Buddhism, whatever aspect of life you might be considering. Then from then onwards in this book, they discuss various problems of the world, problems of society, in the light, really, of what has been said in those first two sections. Oneself and the environment, the connection between us. And then finally, Sensei really lets off a great broadside of Shakubuku. I mean, I think one of the greatest explanations of the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin is contained in the last sections of this book. Incredible. So, in keeping that for the end, he was really saying to Dr. Toynbee, if you listen now to what I'm going to say about this Buddhism, you'll see that it solves everything. So it's masterly shakabuku, this book, in every way. And when we get near the end of these sessions, you'll feel it too, because we've struggled our way through all sorts of aspects of society, and then at the end, this enlightenment, just staggering. So interestingly enough, probably you've heard me already say this, but Sensei said when he came to France this year, that he said, I want you all to be like lighthouses. That is this concept of Causton Rufu that I've been talking about, isn't it? Like a lighthouse, each one of us, lighting the way, if you like, to the future for other people, attracting them by that light, and then guiding them, giving them hope and courage and belief in the future, so that they can face the future, and instead of getting more and more apathetic, really begin to use their lives and their abilities for the sake of Causton Rufu, for the sake of the peace and happiness of the people of the world. So as you know, through this dialogue, Toynbee agreed in the end with everything. One point he couldn't agree in was euthanasia, the right of a person to say, if they're virtually becoming vegetables through sickness or whatever, to have the right to ask to be put out. But of course Sensei couldn't agree to that. As a Buddhist, we are taught, and we begin to understand we should live the full span of our lives. Because even up to the very last minute, we're affecting, aren't we, our environment in ways that might be exceedingly important for other people and things in that environment. The Sensei was strict on that point. And then, oddly enough, this wonderful, great old man, this old scholar, suffered a severe stroke and spent his last year of life exactly in that condition, completely paralyzed. He couldn't talk, and he couldn't eat without it being liquids and so on. Yet, when he died, and I rang his old secretary, a lady who'd been with him for many, many, many years, she said the incredible thing about him was that always his eyes were shining throughout that year. His spirit never ever died in any way. And we used to feel, she said, that he was still working, although he was physically paralyzed. So one wonders what his mind was doing in that time. Was he beginning to say, that fellow Ikeda, he was probably right. Working out things still for himself with his strong seeking mind about life, I'm quite sure, and probably preparing himself for death and feeling perfectly happy about it. It's very moving, I think, because this was the great impression that this lady, his secretary, and also his family, had of his life in that last year. So I guess that by the end, he'd agreed with everything that Sensei had said to him, because there's only that one point that was a difference of opinion about. So this is the way of Causton Rufu. And the other thing I wanted to just mention is that we completely tend to discount. I've been talking about our individual action, right, on our particular path of life. But we tend to completely discount the incredible power of our daimoku. It's not easy to grasp that. Of course it's not. Because it's an unseeing power which eventually reveals itself in results. So you chant for peace in Northern Ireland. You think nothing's happening. But the point is, it is. Even if there are 20 people chanting for peace in Northern Ireland, something is happening, but nothing like what can happen if 1,000 people are sincerely desiring peace in Northern Ireland and chanting for it and keeping it strongly in their ichnim, or whatever else the goal may be. The power of Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo is colossal. We can see it sometimes in our own experiences, can't we? In our own individual lives, we can bring about incredible change. In our own individual lives, just through our own daimoku. Multiply our own daimoku by 100, 1,000, 10,000. The power of 10,000 people chanting Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo is unbelievable. So Sensei said not long ago, I think it was a couple of years ago, that in his view, when every country in the world has a minimum of 10,000 people chanting Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo, Causton Rufu will be achieved. Of course, it's then got to be maintained forever, but it will have been achieved. Of course, if there are 10,000 people chanting Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo in every country of the world, some countries by then will have millions chanting. So that was his view, based, of course, on his experience of seeing the gradual change that is occurring in Japan. So when we get towards 10,000 members, we'll really have a struggle, just the same as we had an incredible struggle when we were getting near to 1,000 members. There was a real struggle to get from 700 to 1,000 members. The Sanshishima that occurred really tried its best to hold us back. And I'm sure the same thing will happen when we're approaching 10,000, because these targets are so significant. The target of 1,000, the target of 3,000, which is Ichinen Sanzen, the target of 10,000. These are real, incredible, important milestones in the movement for Causton Rufu. So let's begin anyway. I hope you understand why I've done it this way, and I hope it worked. And now we want to go back from these social matters to the inner self. But of course, the inner self and social matters are inextricably involved. That's why, in the end, everything that happens in society begins within the inner self of one human being or a group of human beings, doesn't it? So this is a very important point to begin. So what really both the authors discuss, and rightly so, is the conflict that is continually taking place within a human being's life, because physically the human being is an animal, yet spiritually he is able to think and make judgment in a realm which is not available to animals, which is beyond the animal, something higher. So this creates a great conflict in life. In a sense, in that sense, our animal body is part of our environment in relation to the inner self. Right? It's part of our outer self, in a sense, if you view life from the point of view of the inner or spiritual life. And in the same way, of course, that principle of Shikishin Funi, just the same as Esho Funi, the inseparability of us and our environment. In the case of the indivisibility of the body and the spirit, that principle is confirming that. The body reflects the inner self, the spiritual self, just the same as the body can affect the spiritual self. And the two are really one and indivisible, although they're two different things. So Shiki, Shin, Funi. Shiki means body. Shin means the spiritual aspect of life. And Funi means indivisible or inseparable. In literally it means two yet not two. two are so closely tied together. So we could say, couldn't we, because of this situation of the human being and the makeup of the human being, that probably there are three alternatives to the way we decide to live. The first is to decide to let our inner self become animal, just the same as our outer self. And I'm sure we all know or have heard of or have met some people who have reached that state of human degradation. Especially in war, I can think of meeting people who had reached that state because of the demoralization on the human spirit of war, living really like animals, thinking like and acting in animal ways, based on instinct, in the world of animality, isn't it? That is one solution, one way to live. You can choose. And the second way is the way that most religions have tried to tackle this problem, I think. And that is to struggle to try to separate the spiritual aspect of your life from the physical aspect. In other words, to put it in the old sort of biblical language, to separate the spirit from the flesh. Of course, it's impossible. The commandments of Christianity are based on that, separating the body from the spirit, the flesh from the spirit. Buddhism would say, ridiculous. How can you? Because the body and the spirit as a whole are part of life. That's not the way we were supposed to live, to try to tear ourselves apart from those living impulses and desires which are part of the physical makeup in us, the animal instinct. We've got to live with it in some way. And of course the whole struggle of people who've tried to be good Christians, and I can certainly speak there with experience, is that one found it impossible. One couldn't separate the desires of the flesh, as it's put, from one's life, because they were innately in it. One might have tried to repress them, but like a spring that you were pushing down, eventually they must explode. So this caused people incredible pain, and especially from guilt. A great agony was created in people's lives who were trying to sincerely to follow such teachings. Then Buddhism says the third way, is really the only way that is practical to a human being, which is to recognize both the fleshly desires as well as spiritual life as part of human life, something that is innately within us, and then to find the means to transform those desires from something that could be negative and destructive, harmful, hurtful to others, to something valuable. And this is, of course, what that principle of turning desires into enlightenment is. So that energy is innately in life, the energy, the impulses of desires. It's just that they have to be turned from their negative and destructive side to their positive side. And of course Buddhism points out that everything in life has both a positive side and a negative side. Nothing in our lives, in other words, isn't valuable if we can choose and find the effort to make it so. So we could just consider these alternatives a little. And the Ikeda and Toynbee choose what first? Nothing else but our good old friend, sex. as the first thing that they discuss. Why? Because this is such an incredibly powerful influence, such a powerful impulse, the most powerful in our lives, actually, because it is also the power which brings about procreation and the continuance of the species. Therefore, it cannot be disrupted. It has to be there. Otherwise, the species called human beings would disappear. This is what makes it so complicated for us, so difficult. And I'm sure everyone would agree. This is a great, difficult problem. How to deal with this matter. There is no deterrent built into our lives against the sexual impulse. There are no defenses. If you eat too much, that is a desire, right? But you're sick, aren't you? You just bring the whole lot up. That's that. So that is the deterrent built into our lives if we eat too much. If we sleep too much, which is another animal impulse, we find after a bit we've lost our job, we haven't got any money, and we begin to feel miserable about our lives, and we make some action to stop sleeping too much. If we fight, if we're violent in nature, even there is a deterrent. In the end, something says to us, well, if I go on like this, I'm going to get killed by somebody. So that is a deterrent, isn't it? But for sex, there aren't any. There ain't none. But when I was thinking about this last night, preparing this lecture, it did strike me, you know. We all know that through cause and effect, we can create something. What the Gosho and the Lotus Sutra teaches us is that we didn't find the Gohonzon or the Buddha by chance. Because our hearts yearn more and more, our paths crossed somebody's path who could teach us about the Gohonzon. Cause and effect, isn't it? So one does begin to think, if you take the terrible problem of AIDS, for example, is this because there are people in this world who feel, you know, that sex has too much control of their lives and are trying to find a way, yearning in their subconscious, of course, not so much probably in their conscious minds, but yearning to be able to find a way to overcome this. Of course, that wouldn't occur if someone was chanting Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo, because you know you can overcome it. But to those who are lost without Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo, couldn't that be so? I've certainly, in my life, had experience where a physical ailment helped me to take control over my life. Definitely. So it's worth pondering, isn't it? People don't like their lives to be out of control. Of course they don't. Nobody wants their life to be out of control. People whose lives are out of control are in hell in a spiritual sense. So for us now, we're able to begin to take control of these things, and we know that if we pursue this practice, we shall. I'm not only talking about sex, I'm talking about violent anger or whatever. We know that we can do it. We've seen a little bit of a difference already since we started to practice. And perhaps it's difficult to remember what it was like when we were floundering and had nothing that we could grip onto. Anyway, it's an interesting thought, that's all it is. Don't go around saying that's Mr. Causton's That's Buddhism or something, the thing I said about AIDS. But it's an interesting reflection. There is a cause and effect. I feel it could easily be, that yearning to find something that could put a stop to one's life being out of control. Definitely we do see in society the animal instincts running wild. Definitely one can see it in all directions. For example, men and women who are sincerely worried and probably hold discussions about overpopulation, yet, through not having control, they produce unwanted babies, perhaps. All those sort of strange paradoxes. And then we look at the media, at pornography. What are they doing? Nothing else but encouraging sex purely for self-satisfaction. That is all they're doing. Which means sex at the expense of someone else, at the expense of their happiness, or perhaps causing hurt or harm in the process. So that sort of spiritual pollution is also existing everywhere in this age of Mapo, which it was our destiny to be born into. So, there is, if this went on unchecked, if there was nothing that appeared to take control or to help human beings to take control over their lives, it could go on and on. After all, you can walk through a park any time you like, probably. Or no, not any time you like, but it happens to be at the right time. You'll see couples at it in full daylight under the bushes. Not even really bothering to hide. It's unbelievable, but that is totally animal, isn't it? Actually, a sensei says, I think he doesn't talk about couples under bushes, but a sensei says it's worse than animals, because animals carry out these natural functions in a very natural way. It doesn't occur to them because they're not thinking, judging people. But we are, and we tend to feel that those sort of matters are best done in private in order to preserve the dignity of human life. But you can see lots of instances where it's not being preserved and people don't seem to care. Human beings don't have a period when they're on heat. Human beings can be on heat all the time. This is the dilemma. This is the dilemma of the human being where the sexual impulse is concerned, isn't it? So Toynbee says there is nothing that can put this matter right except, he calls it love. Sensei would call it compassion. That is to say, Toynbee too is not saying that we've got to smother the sexual impulse or try and repress it. In a way, he was saying even then, somehow or other, the sex impulse has got to be based on love. So Sensei expanded that and pointed out that if it was based on the Buddha state, he didn't speak at that time even so directly as that, but what he was saying was if it's based on the Buddha state, the sexual impulse will be absolutely one with the wisdom and compassion which arises from that Buddha state. So that explains, doesn't it, that line in the Gosho when Nichiren Daishonin said, even in the act of love, chant Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo. He didn't mean literally in the middle of the act. Of course not. What he meant was that the act of love should be founded on Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo, should be based on Daimoku like everything else. Then the act of love would be in the Bodhisattva state. The state of the action would be in the Bodhisattva state, arising from the Buddha state, wouldn't it? The Bodhisattva state, which is desiring to give happiness to another person. Not concerned with happiness for yourself, though of course understanding that the greatest way to be happy is to give happiness to someone else, but giving that from one's heart to make someone happy. That is what he means, even in the act of love, chant Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo. It's the pause, the 3 daimoka you chant in yourself. Should I or shouldn't I? Am I going to cause this person harm or hurt or not? It's putting on the brake. Braking power. If we're truly living our lives based on the Gohonzon or based on Daimoku, what idiots we are if we forget to use it in terms of our sexual relationships. Crazy. Most dangerous thing of all. So it's braking power. It's pausing. Just saying, is it right? Am I going to cause this person harm? Chanting a few daimoku inside yourself. Saying, I must go to the loo for a moment, or the bathroom, or whatever. And chanting daimoku and making sure. I'm not joking. I'm speaking what Nichiren Daishonin taught. What is sense instead of nonsense? How ridiculous to go around basing everything on our daimoku except that. Isn't it? It's crazy. But of course I know the impulse is so strong. Isn't it? I see we've got a lady present, so I must be careful what I say. But what I was going to say was, otherwise in a flash, you've got your trousers down. But it's not the way to live a happy life. You have to bring Nam-Myoho-Renge-Kyo into the sexual life as well as every other aspect of your life. You can't leave it out. You have to chant daimoku about it if you want to stop slandering other people's lives. If you want to stop using other people for the sake of your sexual satisfaction, you have to be sure. Buddhism is not saying sex is wrong. Buddhism is recognizing the sexual impulse that exists in all of us. But Buddhism is saying, use it with wisdom and compassion. That's really what it's all about, isn't it? So both the authors of this dialogue agree so much on that. It's all a matter of human dignity, isn't it? In the end. Whether you slander or whether you don't slander. That's what it's all about. So Toynbee, I think, interestingly, brings up the point that the present state of society has all been brought about by war. That the 2 world wars were the direct cause of this messy state which society is in terms of permissiveness now. That once you tell a man or a woman that it's right to kill another human being, you're on the most vulnerable point, aren't you, in all ethical matters. If you can kill a person, then what's the matter with taking drugs? What's the matter with giving in to all these desires? So war is at the root of it. And I think we can say we saw that clearly in the ultimate degradation in the Vietnamese War. Many of you may be seen films about it. Some of them may be exaggerated, of course, like many films, but generally speaking, the Vietnamese War was a war of utter human degradation. Because they didn't want to kill. They were made to do so. And in the process of doing so, it tore their hearts out. It took all hope away from them. So that was really the worst that one's ever seen, I think. The other two world wars were bad enough. But in terms of human degradation, the Vietnamese War was the worst. Of course, in World War I and World War II, there was a cause which the priests and the statesmen and everyone could lay at the feet of the people and say, you must fight, in order to prevent an evil regime swamping the world. That could get people's hearts. But in the case of Vietnam, the reason for the war was cloudy and unclear, and seemed ridiculous to some people. Of course, war is, therefore, isn't it, the utmost evil, the beginning of degradation. I mean, I know it myself, from being in World War II. I did become degraded to a definite degree. It wasn't so bad as to make me actually behave in a way which was out of control. But in my heart, I was degraded. Definitely. It had a profound, deep effect on me. It does that to you, war. It wipes away all values. It takes the meaning, if you like, of what goodness is, what value is, and distorts it completely. So this is a terrible thing. I often think that maybe the effect of that is almost the worst aspect of war. It's not just the killing and destruction, but it's the destruction of people's inner lives, the distortion which it causes, and which affects actually everybody, not just soldiers, but in the case of the world wars, also it affected the people who were not fighting, the civilians as well. It was infectious. And of course, the families are broken up with killing, injury, separation. Everything is broken up by it. So Mr. Toda was really right, I think, when he singled out war as being the utmost evil in human existence. People torn out of their normal social framework, losing direction completely. So I can remember the effect of World War I, because I was born just after that finished. So that led into a period which was called the Roaring Twenties. But the Roaring Twenties were nothing like this present age. The Roaring Twenties really only referred to a small section of the population, mostly middle and upper class so-called people who were usually quite wealthy backgrounds. And it was they who roared through life. It was very, sort of looking back on it, you see it in quite a lot of movies and things these days, because it was quite, in a way, exciting and romantic and all the rest of it. You know, it was big Bentley sports cars and long cigarette holders and very short skirts and occasionally taking drugs when no one was looking, all that sort of thing. But it only affected just a small minority of the people. However, it was a beginning, definitely. Then, of course, after World War II, that, you know, the Roaring Twenties became something much bigger. And one saw, you know, this, really, these impulses running wild. And human dignity really disintegrated in many ways. So probably I've talked for nearly 50 minutes, mate. Time we had a break, isn't it? Shall we pause there, then carry on? So what, 15 minutes, Robert?
Yes, fine.
Okay, everybody. Are you all with me so far?
Oh, yes.
Okay, great. Have a good cup of coffee.
Didn't seem like a long time.
No.
Very.
I hope I've covered everything I'm supposed to have covered.